Hey everybody, I am Lucas Martell. I am the creator of Walkabout Mini Golf. I'll go ahead and give this a shot. Hopefully not embarrass myself too much.
That's awesome. I wouldn't have done that. That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, and today we're joined by Andrew Eiche. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name right. From Alchemy. So
correct.
Maybe you can, if you want to intro yourself a little bit.
I'm Andrew Eiche. I'm the COOwl and Cable Slinger at Alchemy Labs. For those of you who don't know, Alchemy Labs makes the games Job Simulator, Vacation Simulator, Rick and Morty Virtual Rick-ality, and most recently we launched our game this year, Cosmonious High. So very excited to be here.
Yeah,
we'll take a
shot.
shot.
Fantastic. I won't talk while you putt.
Ooh,
or I will talk.
That was not great, but I think I can make up from that.
Now, you've never played this course either, so it's not the you won't be judged too harshly on your putting skills.
There we go.
So I'm very curious to kind of hear about the history of Alchemy, because you guys have been around in the VR space specifically for a really long time. Maybe you can just sort of talk about kind of how Alchemy got started and all that.
Yeah, so Alchemy Labs was originally four-person company that made mobile games, right? And I wasn't part of that era, but early on, we saw the potential in VR with kind of the DK1, built some experiences out for DK1, for Cardboard, for some other things, and that got Valve excited at the time, and they were building the what would eventually become the Vive, right? And so they invited us to talk on stage about our experience, and then eventually invited us to create, kind of an initial experience for GDC in 2015, and that experience was Job Simulator. I joined, at the later part of the development of Job Simulator, and have been there ever since. But yeah, that's kind of where we got our start. So we've been around since then, and our philosophy has always been like VR of the near, and this very, very highly interactive version of hands, and kind of this like maximalist, like everything you see can be picked up and moved and touched. So yeah, that's kind of where we got our start. Here, let me see. Okay. See if I can give it enough oomph. No, not enough oomph. So, oh well.
Takes a lot of oomph to get over the hill. Yeah, that's always been the thing that impressed me the most with your guys' stuff, is just sort of like how it's kind of the opposite from a philosophical idea. Like, whereas we're doing generally big worlds and the interaction is that you play mini golf through them, you guys are going very much the opposite of sort of like containing people within a relatively small space, but literally you can do just about anything within that very small subset. Even then, though, when I say that, sort of like there are a lot of, if you look at Job Simulator or many of your other games, like there's so many various interactions. Like, I'm curious, how do you go about planning all of those? And do you actually end up just sort of like, are every single one of those interactions just sort of like custom designed for how different things interact when you put them together?
So it's it's a little bit of both, right? So we start with these custom designs, and then we go from there, right? So we'll build an interaction, and it will be, for instance, like, oh, it'd be funny if you had a copier and it perfectly copied everything you put in it, or in Cosmonious High, like you had chemicals. But then we build something systemic on top of that, and we see where the players go. And what we're looking for is them to get, like, we do a ton of playtesting, and they get, almost like a sigh of disappointment. And so if they sigh in disappointment, then we go in and fill that interaction out, right? And what we're looking for is that delight to be there. And so we spend a lot of effort really building like these kind of systemic things too, which help us, but there's still a lot of like, we definitely thought about these things. This is why I'm bad at chatting and putting, or just in real life I'm bad at putting. We'll get there on this one. But yeah, we definitely think about, kind of how the interactions would play out, and namely what would feel good and what wouldn't, right? So like in our game, mini golf would feel good, but a lot of times what we try to do is don't make someone else's game, is a lot of times what we say, right?
Yeah.
So like you all have created the idealistic version of mini golf. This is great. This fulfills the fantasy in probably the most extreme way, right? The course itself is such a powerful part of what makes mini golf, and being able to be in fantastical versions is like uniquely yours, and we wouldn't do that. So don't make a crappy version of somebody else's game and then lean into what ours does best. So, you know, how are the controllers, which are imprecise ways of picking things up? We don't like do tiny little pieces of things because tiny doesn't work well with controllers. We don't do that. So, you know, in many ways we set up systemic things for the players, and then we set up systemic things for ourselves, and we kind of go from there.
Interesting. So it's sort of like, it's kind of like that emergent gameplay, but then where it might fall down and it might start to get a little, you know, there's an emergent pattern that you actually want people to use, you kind of find and add some custom stuff on top of that to sort of like,
right.
Yeah,
or if there's an emergent,
it.
Or if a pattern appears where it's like, this is not going to be great, then what we do is we put a joke in there. So that way people don't feel bad. You don't run into the invisible wall. Instead, the invisible wall like almost reacts to you.
And that's such a great thing for like, that's like classic adventure game. Like that was something that like LucasArts was doing back in the day, where like if you had a puzzle solution that in your head you figured out could maybe work, but it wasn't how it was game designed, the joke really sort of like made it not feel bad because like, oh, they thought about that, but that's not what they want me to do. So that's
right.
Yeah,
we take a ton of inspiration from LucasArts. Like if you really categorized our games, you know, into what they are, a lot of times they end up being something closer to, you know, what would a LucasArts adventure be, but with your hands, right?
Yeah.
And we go a little less story heavy than they went, but we're still, you know, we're still focusing on that. Like how the cool part of those games was just like exploring what could be.
Right. And you know, and that's funny. I had never even put the two together to think that, like, oh yeah, that of course that you guys have also looked at that or thought about that, because that was this. I was just making that connection, that one thing. But now that you say it, it makes total sense that that would be one of the sources of inspiration for you guys. Just those early LucasArts games. Yeah,
you got me there because I was like, you gotta, yeah. That's heartbreaking, but I'll make up for it here. We're gonna just say. First course blues. All right, bogey.
So
I'll take it.
So I'm also curious. You mentioned, because like Job Simulator, I never played the DK1 or the DK2 version even. So if that was, well, wait, no, you said that the Job Simulator.
No,
was
so we made.
So you had the hand controllers at that point.
Right. So we took a game we had called you know, for the Awesome, which was based on another game created by a company, Diegetic, and it was just like a base jumping game. That's what we did on DK1 and DK2, right? So no real controller involvement. And then when we saw the controllers, it was like, wow, this is awesome. And actually our CEO tells a story about where he was actually depressed when he saw the like famous Vive room that they talk about, which is like they have a name for it. But anyway, because he's like, this is what needs to exist, and it's so far from what does exist, and consumers won't get to play that. They'll just be stuck with bad VR. So he was delighted when he found out they had actually figured that out. But we had versions of the headset back when the controllers were like wired to your body. Okay. So you actually had like a VR belt you had to wear, and then you could, and then you were allowed to VR.
That is so interesting. Yeah, I guess I was also I'm also remembering now sort of like that early days of commercial VR, and just like how much I really thought when the hand controllers came out, my first thought was like, oh, that's going to be a gimmick. Like that's not really going to add that much. And until you actually played it, until you actually got to experience it, it was hard to just imagine like how much immersion. And in retrospect, it's like, you know, slap your head. Of course, that's like almost half the experience. Right. But
and I think the other interesting thing about, you know, controllers is like you said, you wouldn't think that was the thing. that ultimately it was up to, it's like you think, oh, the headset, the way the hands were, the way the head works and looking and its eyesight, that's all of it. And like your hands, what are you talking about? And then it was like, oh, actually, you're right. Hands are what does it. Like they really make the experience.
Oh yeah, totally. Are there any big technological or software just like what are the things that you think would add that we don't have or that is not quite working that you think would really sort of like take VR to the next level? Is there anything that you're missing?
It's not that we're missing, it's that we're in early days of something. So Alchemy already announced that our next title is going to be fully hand-tracked as its primary input and possibly fully hand-tracked as its only input. And so we really believe in hand tracking to a degree that would be, kind of unexpected, but it's kind of like you said, where we saw the writing with controllers, we're seeing the same thing with hand tracking. And then face tracking is also something interesting. So you and I are chatting right now, right? But like, not to knock on like everybody's avatars has the same problem, which is either lifeless eyes or inaccurate eyes, right? But to be able to actually get facial shapes out of the game and to see what, to see how what your players are experiencing and feeling is really going to change, the way that social VR works. Totally. And this whole heuristic for like putting.
It's actually funny that you mentioned the eye thing. So we did a lot of work on our avatars for this game to actually design around some of the limitations of current VR, and one of them was actually choosing to not do realistic eyes, just because if it's more abstract, I'd much rather have something that is low res but stylized and looks appealing, as opposed to when you don't make eye contact with somebody, it's the worst feeling in the world, and it just gets into
right, and it's almost
valley,
easier to go in and patch that in, right, than it is to be like, okay, we could take our lower fidelity avatars and we build on that, but we can't necessarily build on these like super high fidelity. You either have it or you don't.
There's also something. Oh, that worked out really well for me.
I was like, that is such a pro. I made the game move right there. I was like, let me just get it over the hill. This will be fine.
So, there's actually been a couple of conversations. I think I even read one on Reddit recently, and people were asking about NPCs in VR. And they were commenting that you just don't see many of them, but you guys have done a decent number of those, both in Rick and Morty and in Job Simulator. You have some, but I remember Rick and Morty, I was really impressed with some of the stuff that you were doing with the NPCs in there. What was the sort of like, was that hard, or was that something that you guys sort of like already had up your sleeve in terms of how to make those NPCs work?
So it's incredibly difficult, right? So Rick and Morty, it's funny that you mentioned those two, right? Because the real innovation, one of the biggest innovations we have in Cosmonious High, our newest game, is actually the NPCs are even better, right? So Rick and Morty, it was our first game ever as a studio using bipedal 2D characters that moved around, and we had to think of lots of things, but like you could never enter the NPC space. So we made a lot of very strategic decisions about how to interact with that, where you couldn't really touch Rick or Morty except for at one point in the game. And then when we went to do Cosmonious High, we were like, well, part of high school is like high-fiving your friends and being around these people. So we built what was, arguably to date one of the most significant like character systems. So you can be talking with a character, you can throw something to them, they'll catch it, they'll respond in kind either about that or continue the line if it's important. And not only all of that, but the whole system is built on top of a puppetry system. So we don't use mocap, we actually just puppet in VR what they're doing, and we do it for every line in the game. And so but it's years and years. So like if you look at Job Simulator, right, there are boxes that float. And so we got to learn a lot in a safe environment. Okay, we only have these boxes that float. Let's start there. And then it was like, okay, we got the boxes that float, they buzz, you could throw stuff, you don't ever touch them, that's great. Let's put in bipedal characters. Still don't touch them, but we see what it feels like to have them in their space. And then with Cosmonius, it was like, well, technically with Vacation Simulator, we're like, okay, maybe now the boxes can be in your space. And then with Cosmonius, it was like, okay, we have 3 different types of aliens, and 2 of them like locomote across the ground. And what if you could like high five and interact and talk and do all these different things with characters and have all these systems on systems? And what we built was this like wild set of like smushed together systems that work to create these really believable experiences. And we're one of the only games, like normally in VR, you get a single high fidelity character, or you get lots of low fidelity characters. And we're one of the few games with like up to like 5 or 6 high fidelity characters on the screen at the same time. And characters interacted, like they talk to each other too, and they like interact. So the whole thing makes the world feel believable. But it was like, what you're seeing is the result of, 6 years of progress.
I mean, that is it. It seems like a lot of the folks who are having success in the VR space are ones who are doing kind of like that, where you're able to sort of like, you're able to build a relatively small game, but then take that tech and build on it and do more with the next game. So I would imagine that pretty much everything you do is sort of like, you're able to take either all those lessons, or do you actually have sort of like a larger, your own engine or your own tool set that you're basically able to bring in? So something you developed early on, you get it for free.
We have something, and we have our own tech, right? Everything's owls, right? So it's owl tech and owl core, right? And so we have a core set of tech that we bring between each and every game. So we're always moving that core along, and it's been really helpful for us. So I'm sure there's job simulator things in our latest game that we're working on that are just like hanging around, code from that. I'm sure there's some code that I wrote, unfortunately, for our programmers.
I said the same thing to Eddie. Like, there's a lot of my code that we're gradually going through and pulling out. I mean, some of it's okay, but it's sort of like, it's I'm embarrassed by it.
Yeah, I think that like the cup self-stabilization code is code that's still in there that I wrote, where it's like, a cup filled with water is more stable than one not. But it's like, we've just been building off this Alchemy core tech for a long time, and so that's what helps us. Our goal is to write as little of it as possible, of course, because like, as you're aware, the more code you have to maintain, the worse it gets. But
right, totally.
But we do have these set of things, and then it's kind of funny because what happens with us in VR is that we build a set of code with the expectation and all these caveats, and then as systems get better, we actually rip it out. So PlayStation 1, it needed a lot of help to do interpretive things, right? PlayStation VR 1, right? Well, the latest version of VR, controllers are stable. They aren't floating away. They aren't doing all these things that happened previously. And because of that, we actually end up removing code. So we're in the same boat right now with hand tracking, where we're doing like tons and tons of work. And then someday somebody's going to release a device where it's like, oh yeah, we got like 5 more cameras on the device, and all this extra tracking you're doing for when the hands disappear is irrelevant.
I was actually just going to ask about that, because that's something that we've played around with hand tracking a little bit, and definitely gotten to the point that it's like, okay, for what we're doing, it is definitely not accurate and not responsive enough. Like, to control a club, especially when that club is going to be 5 feet, beyond where you're at, like, you need absolute accuracy. Like, something like this is not going to be replaced by hand tracking anytime soon. Maybe eventually, but is that the main thing?
I would say it might be sooner than you think, and we have a lot of, we face similar accuracy problems, so we have a lot of the same battle we're doing, but much like, right, like, think about first-person shooters, right? Everyone was like, first-person shooters can't exist on consoles, and then, GoldenEye figured out some stuff, they figured out auto-aim, and then Halo really figured it out. And so a lot of what we're doing is kind of what Halo did, where it's like, sure, you might think you can't do this, but with all the work we're putting in, you absolutely can. You just have to build a lot of systems like, auto aim and leading and predictions and things like that. The problem is that for a studio that like you all were maybe you haven't been building up this library because we did hand tracking back in Vacation Simulator. You're starting from zero, right? We're starting from, oh, well, we solved a lot of problems in Vacation Simulator, and while we're rewriting it all, we at least know what we face.
Totally, that makes a lot of sense then. Well, and do you mind me asking, and I'm not trying to, if you're not ready to talk about it, I am kind of curious how far you guys are able to go in terms of like, because even the hands that you're using in all of your other games are generally, you're not doing fine finger controls, you're not necessarily doing gestures, it's really, you're able to sort of like do it with just like a single button or two. Are you guys following a similar pattern, or are you finding that you're even able to do gestural stuff or more detailed finger stuff, or is it still mostly sort of like hand has one or two states at this point?
So the way that I can best describe it without like, giving up the house here is that like we've almost taken a step backwards where it's like we actually get to do we rely less on like gestures and like because we could do more diegetic controls, right? Because now we have fingers like on Job Simulator, right, we had this keyboard and it was like big 1 and big 0. And why? Because you just got mitts. It's like you have boxing gloves on. But now we're finding like, oh, with individual fingers, we can actually have a lot more fine control. So we're focused much more on like the diegetic. Hey, finally it actually shows that I play this game. Much more on the diegetic, on the physical actions you can take than necessarily on a bunch of gestures memorized. And it's even more natural, we're finding, than like, I put my parents, I put a number of people in various games, and it's like, press the A button. And they're like, you put a blindfold on me. What the hell is A? Right? And then in this case, you're like, just reach out and grab, or just poke that button, or just flip that switch, and all of that is very, very straightforward.
That's really cool to hear, because it's kind of been one of my things that I've said for a long time. Like when people say, I want Minority Report. You do not want Minority Report. That's a movie where they've taken sort of like what he's doing and been able to sort of like make it look like it's all just responding perfectly, but like that idea of just having an infinite number of hand gestures, doing it more diegetically is really, really smart.
Why does everybody use dystopian fiction, right? Like I've bumped into companies, they're like, we want Ready Player One. And it's like, no, you don't. Everybody lived in a stack one in Cleveland. Okay, no disrespect for Cleveland. The river did light on fire once, but they've gotten better. But like, you want to be in these like stacks? Like people use it as escape, or like you're saying, like, Minority Report was dystopian fiction. It was going to jail for crimes you had not yet committed, right? So it just amuses me.
Here's the counter thing, though. Name me one future sci-fi that isn't dystopian, with the exception of Star Trek. This is the quiz portion of the.
Let me think. This is good. Star Trek is always a great example because it's always supposed to be the idealistic. I'll think of that. Let me think of that as you take your putt here for 1 second.
Yeah. Well, here, this might be the last putt of our 9 holes here.
Dystopian, fiction is the lens that is used by, sci-fi is the lens that is used to like show through to society. So I guess you're right there.
That's more just me as sort of like my screenwriter side kicking in, as sort of like, how do you do a sci-fi without having it being somewhat dystopian, because that's just the
right. Well, and I guess it's more like the question is the setting dystopian, or is the unit? Because there's a lot of sci-fi that's like old sci-fi that isn't truly dystopian. Like the but it's the specific chunk that you're looking at. So, and I forgot who wrote the short story, but there's a short story about living on Venus and the sun only rising one day a year through the clouds and locking a kid in the closet, right? That's not dystopian. That's just the reality of living on this planet. So
maybe, I think hard sci-fi, like The Martian would be another example of one. It's like it's still
The Martian wasn't dystopian at all.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and
that was and
to a point, like even further, like Arrival is one where it's not dystopian. It's actually like the opposite. They're like preventing dystopia.
True. Yeah. There we go. Okay. I needed to have some positive sci-fi in my life, so I need to go back and rewatch.
There you go.
Yeah.
But
rewatch.
But yeah, it's just kind of one of those interesting things where I think going back to where the conversation started, right, is that when you're looking to the future, right, the goal of a filmmaker is very different from the goal of a user, right?
Yes.
And it's the famous thing, like if you ever see, actual NASA helmets and movie NASA helmets, movie helmets always have like a row of lights just blasting the actor's face. Why?
Yeah.
You paid $20 million, to get Matt Damon in the movie. You got to show the actor's face. But then when you look at actual helmets, they're like, no, in fact, there's like a visor and a shield to prevent the sun from like hurting their eyes and all these other things. Because in practicality, like the user experience of what it is to be on this very dangerous thing, a spacewalk, has incredibly different goals from, we paid $1 billion to put this human in space and we don't want them to like re-enter the atmosphere and burn up, right? We want them to successfully complete their mission and be safe. So I think that's where people get turned around, and what they want is the emotion they see like Robert Downey Jr. putting into like throwing away a file by shooting a basket. But they don't want to actually throw away a file by shooting a basket.
Yeah. you want that aha moment. And that's 100% Minority Report of just like that. It's like,
right,
it just looks really cool on screen.
Right, and I think that's where like the big difference between like what we're creating versus when you hear folks talk about the Minority Report is, we're building off of user-centered design, right? Lots of play testing, lots of what feels good, lots of what plays well, and then a lot of like role playing. Instead of asking what makes you look like you're doing a lot of cool computing stuff, we ask what makes you feel like you're doing it, right? And so if you were going to make Minority Report VR, everyone would think that you just have your hands up floating in there. But it's like, no, what was the feel there? It was doing this kind of like deeper inspection and this like detective work. And obviously it was up because the cameras, they have Tom Cruise. They're not going to point the camera down at a desk. But for us, we would be like, okay, what's comfortable? And we want you to feel as if you are doing that kind of actual investigative work and splitting apart those files and doing all that thing. And so getting that feeling. And I think like, to what performs best in VR, right? And then I'll stop like rambling on and on. But I think that your game is a great example of this. What does best in VR is allowing people to role play. Right? And allowing people to not to do, but to be. And I think that looking at Walkabout, because this is where we are, this allows people to be. But when we go to mini golf, we so desire that it is this zany version of the crazy, like holes where even just the hole design, like shoot a ball in the air and have it go somewhere. The whole course is designed on how not to lose balls because they're expensive.
Yeah.
But in this, it doesn't matter, right? And so you can build this idealistic version of what it's like to be mini golf, what it's like to do that. And I think when you look at the top games, what's really performing well in Oculus is people asking these questions, or not Oculus, what's really performing well in Meta's headsets and even across the board. It's like, how can I be this? And that's the promise of VR. And I think that all too often we get too lost in the what is the game of it all, and what is like, this doesn't feel like a game, or maybe this is too game light, and don't ask ourselves the question of who cares what percentage game do we have, all the pickupables we need, although your pickupable system is great. That's not me knocking that. I love it. I have like a crazy stick. You could tell that I've explored it. But it's more like instead of like, what are the elements of a game? It's more like, what are the elements of role playing in this world that lets me be the person that I want to be? Anyway, that's like my general theory of what makes VR great.
I have one last geeky question. This is maybe just me sort of like wanting to know, but one of the great things about doing more hand tracking and what you're talking about is that also seems like a really great setup for doing more AR stuff. Is that something that you guys have been exploring much, or is that sort of just something you have on the radar?
It's on the radar, to be honest. Like the problem with AR is we really need that Valve moment, right? That not just the moment where you go in the room and it works perfectly, but the moment where you come out of the room and you have that same exact room experience with something consumer. And I've seen a lot of AR demos, right? And I've seen them in perfect lab conditions do what you would want AR to do, but the headset's too bulky, or the optics don't work, or this or that.
Yeah.
And so I'm excited about the like pass through. I think that that's a very valid and powerful way to get us to a lot of the spots that we want to get to with AR, but we're still just not at that spot. You know, Alchemy isn't the company of 15 or 20 years or 10 years out. Alchemy is the company of 2 years out, right? And we're just not at that 2 year, you know, when we're looking at like what's 1-2 years out, hand tracking, that's awesome. And that will feed into AR, but that's where our focus and like lip tracking and, you know, using eyes and those kind of things. Those are on the near horizon. And then we reevaluate and say, is AR there, and there in a way that like there's a large consumer base that could support it, because we also need a bunch of people to play it. We also need to have that growth and see that for that kind of supportive thing. So we're not going to be, you know, there are folks that do great work in that, but we're not going to be out in the like, you know, 5-10 years from now, this is going to be amazing, because that's just not the cycle we release products on.
Well, I think we need to wrap it up here. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Play Rick and Morty, Job Simulator, Cosmonious High. Anything else that you'd like to plug, Andrew?
Yeah, Vacation Simulator and Job Simulator and Cosmonious High. Those are kind of the big ones. They're out. You know, we're doing discounts here and there all holiday season long. So if you don't see a discount on one of those games right now, they're going to be discounted soon enough. And if you want to check out those characters and kind of the latest and greatest where Alchemy landed, Cosmonious is the best game to check out.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for joining us. And yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thanks for having me.